Toronto is the most populous city in Canada and the capital city of the Canadian province of Ontario, with a population of 2,794,356 in 2021. It is the fourth most populous city in North America. The city is the anchor of the Golden Horseshoe, an urban agglomeration of 9,765,188 people as of 2021 surrounding the western end of Lake Ontario. 11 while the Greater Toronto Area proper had a 2021 population of 6,712,341. Toronto is an international center of business, finance, arts, sports, and culture, and is one of the most multicultural and cosmopolitan cities in the world. Indigenous peoples have traveled through and inhabited the Toronto area, located on a broad sloping plateau interspersed with rivers, deep ravines, and urban forest for more than 10,000 years. After the broadly disputed Toronto Purchase, when the Mississauga surrendered the area to the British Crown, the British established the town of York in 1793 and later designated it as the capital of Upper Canada. During the War of 1812, the town was the site of the Battle of York and suffered heavy damage by American troops. York was renamed and incorporated in 1830 as the City of Toronto. It was designated as the capital of the province of Ontario in 1867 during Canadian Confederation. 19. The city proper has since expanded past its original limits through both annexation and amalgamation to its current area of 630 square kilometers to 143.3 square miles. The diverse population of Toronto reflects its current and historical role as an important destination for immigrants to Canada. About half of its residents were born outside of Canada and over 200 ethnic origins are represented among its inhabitants. While the majority of Torontonians speak English as their primary language, over 160 languages are spoken in the city. The Mayor of Toronto is elected by direct popular vote to serve as the chief executive of the city. The Toronto City Council is a unicameral legislative body comprising 25 councillors since the 2018 municipal election, representing geographical wards throughout the city. Toronto is a prominent center for music, theater, motion picture production, and television production, and is home to the headquarters of Canada's major national broadcast networks and media outlets. Its very cultural institutions, which include numerous museums and galleries, festivals and public events, entertainment districts, national historic sites, and sports activities, attract over 43 million tourists each year. Toronto is known for its many skyscrapers and high-rise buildings, in particular the CN Tower, the tallest freestanding structure on land outside of Asia. The city is home to the Toronto Stock Exchange, the headquarters of Canada's 5 largest banks, and the headquarters of many large Canadian and multinational corporations. Its economy is highly diversified with strengths in technology, design, financial services, life sciences, education, arts, fashion, aerospace, environmental innovation, food services, and tourism. Toronto is the third largest tech hub in North America after Silicon Valley and New York City, and the fastest growing hub. The word Toronto has been recorded with various spellings in French and English, including Toronto, 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 and Torrington. The most frequent early spelling, Toronto, referred to the Narrows, a channel of water through which Lake Simcoe discharges into Lake Couchaching, where the Huron had planted tree saplings to corral fish. This Narrows was called Carrington by the Mohawk, meaning where there are trees standing in the water, and was recorded as early as 1615 by Samuel de Champlain. The word Toronto, meaning plenty, also appears in a 1630 to French lexicon of the Huron language, which is also an Iroquoian language. It also appears on French maps referring to various locations, including Georgian Bay, Lake Simcoe, and several rivers. A portage route from Lake Ontario to Lake Huron running through this point, known as the Toronto Carrying Place Trail, led to widespread use of the name. 20th century, ruins on Front Street after the Great Toronto Fire of 1904. The Great Toronto Fire of 1904 destroyed a large section of downtown Toronto. The fire destroyed more than 100 buildings. 68. The fire claimed one victim, John Croft, who was an explosive expert clearing the ruins from the fire. 69. It caused $10,387,000 Canadian dollars in damage, roughly $277,600,000 Canadian dollars in 2020 terms. The city received new European immigrant groups from the late 19th century into the early 20th century, particularly Germans, French, Italians, and Jews. They were soon followed by Russians, Poles, and other Eastern European nations, in addition to the Chinese entering from the West. Like the Irish before them, many of these migrants lived in overcrowded shanty-type slums, such as the Ward, which was centered on Bay Street, now the heart of the country's financial district. As new migrants began to prosper, they moved to better housing in other areas, in what is now understood to be succession waves of settlement. Despite its fast-paced growth, by the 1920s, Toronto's population and economic importance in Canada remained second to the much longer established Montreal and Quebec. However, by 1934, the Toronto Stock Exchange had become the largest in the country. People in Toronto celebrating the victory in Europe, May 1945. In 1954, the city of Toronto and 12 surrounding municipalities were federated into a regional government known as Metropolitan Toronto. The post-war boom had resulted in rapid suburban development. It was believed that coordinated land use strategy and shared services would provide greater efficiency for the region. The metropolitan government began to manage services that crossed municipal boundaries, including highways, police services, water, and public transit. In that year, a half-century after the Great Fire of 1904, disaster struck the city again when Hurricane Hazel brought intense winds and flash flooding. In the Toronto area, 81 people were killed, nearly 1,900 families were left homeless, and the hurricane caused more than 25 million Canadian dollars in damage. Flooded houses near the Humber River after Hurricane Hazel passed through Toronto, 1954. In 1967, the 7 smallest municipalities of metropolitan Toronto were merged with larger neighbors, resulting in a 6-municipality configuration that included the former city of Toronto and the surrounding municipalities of East York, Etobicoke, North York, Scarborough, and York. In the decades after World War II, refugees from war-torn Europe and Chinese job seekers arrived, as well as construction laborers, particularly from Italy and Portugal. Toronto's population grew to more than 1 million in 1951 when large-scale suburbanization began and doubled to 2 million by 1971. Following the elimination of racially-based immigration policies by the late 1960s, Toronto became a destination for immigrants from all over the world. By the 1980s, Toronto had surpassed Montreal as Canada's most populous city and chief economic hub. During this time, in part owing to the political uncertainty raised by the resurgence of the Quebec sovereignty movement, many national and multinational corporations moved their head offices from Montreal to Toronto and Western Canadian cities. Construction of First Canadian Place, the operational headquarters of the Bank of Montreal, in 1975. On January 1, 1998, Toronto was greatly enlarged, not through traditional annexations, but as an amalgamation of the municipality of Metropolitan Toronto and its 6 lower-tier constituent municipalities, East York, Etobicoke, North York, Scarborough, York, and the original city itself. They were dissolved by an act of the Government of Ontario and formed into a single-tier city of Toronto, colloquially dubbed the Megacity, replacing all 6 governments. The merger was proposed as a cost-saving measure by the progressive conservative provincial government under Premier Mike Harris. The announcement touched off vociferous public objections. In March 1997, a referendum, all 6 municipalities produced a vote of more than 3-1 against amalgamation. However, municipal governments in Canada are creatures of the provincial governments, and referendums have little to no legal effect. The Harris government could thus legally ignore the referendum results and did so in April when it tabled the City of Toronto Act. Both opposition parties held a filibuster in the provincial legislature, proposing more than 12,000 amendments that allowed residents on streets of the proposed megacity to take part in public hearings on the merger and adding historical designations to the streets. This only delayed the bill's inevitable passage, given the Progressive Conservatives' majority. North York Mayor Mel Lastman became the first megacity mayor and the 62nd mayor of Toronto with his electoral victory. Lastman gained national attention after multiple snowstorms, including the January blizzard of 1999, dumped 118 centimeters, 46 inches of snow, and effectively immobilized the city. He called in the Canadian Army to aid snow removal by use of their equipment to augment police and emergency services. The move was ridiculed by some in other parts of the country, fueled in part by what was perceived as a frivolous use of resources. 21st century crowds navigating Union Station during the Northeast blackout of 2003. The city attracted international attention in 2003 when it became the center of a major SARS severe acute respiratory syndrome outbreak. Public health attempts to prevent the disease from spreading elsewhere temporarily dampened the local economy. 82 from August 14 to 17, 2003. The city was hit by a massive blackout, which affected millions of Torontonians. It also affected most of southern Ontario and parts of the United States, stranding some hundreds of people in tall buildings, knocking out traffic lights, and suspending subway and streetcar service across the city during those aforementioned days. On March 6, 2009, the city celebrated the 175th anniversary of its inception as the City of Toronto in 1834. Toronto hosted the 4th G20 Summit during June 26 to 27, 2010. This included the largest security operation in Canadian history. Following large-scale protests and rioting, law enforcement arrested more than 1,000 people, the largest mass arrest in Canadian history. Damage from a fallen tree after the December 2013 storm complex passed through Toronto. On July 8, 2013, severe flash flooding hit Toronto after an afternoon of slow-moving, intense thunderstorms. Toronto Hydro estimated 450,000 people were without power after the storm, and Toronto Pearson International Airport reported 126 millimeters 5 in of rain had fallen over 5 hours, more than during Hurricane Hazel, 85. Within 6 months, from December 20th to 22nd, 2013, Toronto was brought to a near halt by the worst ice storm in the city's history, rivaling the severity of the 1998 ice storm, which mainly affected southeastern Ontario and Quebec. At the height of the storm, over 300,000 Toronto Hydro customers had no electricity or heating. 86 Toronto hosted World Pride in June 2014 and the Pan and Parapan American Games in 2015. The city continues to grow and attract immigrants. A 2019 study by Toronto Metropolitan University, then known as Ryerson University, showed that Toronto was the fastest growing city in North America. The city added 77,435 people between July 2017 and July 2018. The Toronto metropolitan area was the second fastest growing metropolitan area in North America, adding 125,298 persons, compared with 131,767 in the Dallas-Fort Worth-Arlington Metroplex in Texas. The large growth in the Toronto metropolitan area is attributed to international migration to Toronto. The COVID-19 pandemic in Canada first occurred in Toronto and was among the hotspots in the country. Toronto was named as one of 16 cities in North America and one of 2 Canadian cities to host matches for the 2026 FIFA World Cup. Toronto covers an area of 630 square kilometers, 243 square miles, 93 with a maximum north-south distance of 21 kilometers, 13 miles. It has a maximum east-west distance of 43 kilometers, 27 miles. and it has a 46-kilometer, 29 miles long waterfront shoreline on the northwestern shore of Lake Ontario. The Toronto Islands and Port Lands extend out into the lake, allowing for a somewhat sheltered Toronto harbor south of the downtown core. An outer harbor was constructed southeast of downtown during the 1950s and 1960s, and it is now used for recreation. The city's limits are formed by Lake Ontario to the south, the western boundary of Marie Curtis Park, Etobicoke Creek, Eglinton Avenue and Highway 427 to the west, Steeles Avenue to the north, and the Rouge River and the Scarborough-Pickering Town Line to the east. Further information, Toronto Ravine System. This section needs additional citations for verification. Please help improve this article by adding citations to reliable sources in this section. Unsourced material may be challenged and removed. July 2016, learn how and when to remove this message. Leaside Bridge crossing the Don Valley Ravine. The Toronto Ravine System and its waterways cut through the city's landscape. The city is mostly flat or gentle hills, and the land gently slopes upward away from the lake. The flat land is interrupted by the Toronto Ravine System, which is cut by numerous creeks and rivers of the Toronto waterway system, most notably the Humber River in the West End. The Don River east of downtown, these two rivers flanking and defining the Toronto Harbor, and the Rouge River at the city's eastern limits. Most of the ravines and valley lands in Toronto today are parklands, and recreational trails are laid out along the ravines and valleys. The original town was laid out in a grid plan on the flat plain north of the harbor, and this plan was extended outwards as the city grew. The width and depth of several of the ravines and valleys are such that several grid streets, such as Finch Avenue, Leslie Street, Lawrence Avenue, and St. Clair Avenue, terminate on one side of a ravine or valley and continue on the other side. Toronto has many bridges spanning the ravines. Large bridges such as the Prince Edward Viaduct were built to span broad river valleys. Despite its deep ravines, Toronto is not remarkably hilly, but its elevation does increase steadily away from the lake. Elevation differences range from 76.5 meters, 251 feet above sea level at the Lake Ontario shore, to 209 meters, 686 feet above sea level near the York University grounds in the city's north end at the intersection of Keele Street. There are occasional hilly areas, in particular, Midtown Toronto, as well as the Silverthorne and Fairbank neighborhoods, have several sharply sloping hills. Lake Ontario remains occasionally visible from the peaks of these ridges as far north as Eglinton Avenue, 7 to 8 kilometers for 0.3 to 5.0 miles inland. Topographical map of Toronto. The terrain increases steadily away from the shoreline. The other major geographical feature of Toronto is its escarpments. During the last ice age, the lower part of Toronto was beneath glacial Lake Iroquois. Today, a series of escarpments mark the lake's former boundary, known as the Iroquois shoreline. The escarpments are most prominent from Victoria Park Avenue to the mouth of Highland Creek, where they form the Scarborough Bluffs. Other observable sections include the area near St. Clair Avenue west between Bathurst Street and the Don River, and north of Davenport Road from Caledonia to Spadina Road. The Casa Loma grounds sit above this escarpment. The geography of the lakeshore has dramatically changed since the first settlement of Toronto. Much of the land on the harbor's north shore is landfill, filled in during the late 19th century. Until then, the lakefront docks, then known as wharves, were set back farther inland than today. Much of the adjacent port lands on the harbor's east side was a wetland filled in early in the 20th century. The shoreline from the harbor west to the Humber River has been extended into the lake. Further west, landfill has been used to create extensions of land such as Humber Bay Park. View of the Toronto Islands, an island chain that bounds Toronto's inner harbor. The Toronto Islands were a natural peninsula until a storm in 1858 severed their connection to the mainland, creating a channel to the harbor. The peninsula was formed by longshore drift taking the sediments deposited along the Scarborough Bluffs shore and transporting them to the island's area. The other source of sediment for the port lands, wetland, and the peninsula was the deposition of the Don River. which carved a wide valley through the sedimentary land of Toronto and deposited it in the shallow harbor. The harbor and the channel of the Don River have been dredged numerous times for shipping. The lower section of the Don River was straightened and channeled in the 19th century. The former mouth drained into a wetland. Today, the Don River drains into the harbor through a concrete waterway, the Keating Channel. To mitigate flooding in the area, as well as to create parkland, a second, more natural mouth was built to the south during the first half of the 2020s, thereby creating a new island, Uquemin-Minising. Neighborhoods and former municipalities. Main articles: History of neighborhoods in Toronto and List of neighborhoods in Toronto. Map of Toronto with major traffic routes. Also shown are the limits of 6 former municipalities, which form the current city of Toronto. Toronto encompasses an area formerly administered by several separate municipalities that were amalgamated over the years. Each developed a distinct history and identity over the years, and their names remain in common use among Torontonians. Former municipalities include East York, Etobicoke, Forest Hill, Mimico, North York, Parkdale, Scarborough, Swansea, Weston, and York. Throughout the city, there exist hundreds of small neighborhoods and some larger neighborhoods covering a few square kilometers. Citation needed. The many residential communities of Toronto express a character distinct from the skyscrapers in the commercial core. Victorian and Edwardian-era residential buildings can be found in enclaves such as Rosedale, Cabbage Town, the Annex, and Yorkville. The Weechwood Park neighborhood, historically significant for the architecture of its homes and for being one of Toronto's earliest planned communities, was designated as an Ontario Heritage Conservation District in 1985. The Casa Loma neighborhood is named after Casa Loma, a castle built in 1911 by Sir Henry Pellet, complete with gardens, turrets, stables, an elevator, secret passages, and a bowling alley. Spadina House is a 19th century manor that is now a museum. Old Toronto, Victorian-era bay and gable houses are a distinct architectural style of residence that is ubiquitous throughout the older neighborhoods of Toronto. The pre-amalgamation city of Toronto covers the downtown core and older neighborhoods to the east, west, and north. It is the most densely populated part of the city. The financial district contains the first Canadian Place, Toronto Dominion Centre, Scotia Plaza, Royal Bank Plaza, Commerce Court, and Brookfield Place. This area includes, among others, the neighborhoods of St. James Town, Garden District, St. Lawrence, Court Town, and Church and Wellesley. From that point, the Toronto skyline extends northward along Yonge Street. Citation needed. Old Toronto is also home to many historically wealthy residential enclaves, such as Yorkville, Rosedale, the Annex, Forest Hill, Lawrence Park, Lytton Park, Deer Park, Moore Park, and Casa Loma, most stretching away from downtown to the north. Citation needed. East and west of downtown, neighborhoods such as Kensington Market, Chinatown, Leslieville, Cabbage Town, and Riverdale are home to bustling commercial and cultural areas, as well as communities of artists with studio lofts, with many middle and upper-class professionals. Citation needed. Other neighborhoods in the central city retain an ethnic identity, including to smaller Chinatowns, the Greektown area, Little Italy, Portugal Village, and Little India, among others. Suburbs, Crescent Town, and the surrounding area from the air. Crescent Town was a post-World War to suburban neighborhood developed in East York. The inner suburbs are contained within the former municipalities of York and East York. These are mature and traditionally working-class areas, consisting primarily of post-World War I small, single-family homes and small apartment blocks. Neighborhoods such as Crescent Town, Thorncliffe Park, Flemington Park, Weston, and Oakwood Village consist mainly of high-rise apartments, which are home to many new immigrant families. During the 2000s, many neighborhoods became ethnically diverse and underwent gentrification due to increasing population and a housing boom during the late 1990s and the early 21st century. The first neighborhoods affected were Leaside and North Toronto, gradually progressing into the western neighborhoods in York. Citation needed. In an attempt to curb suburban sprawl, many suburban neighborhoods in Toronto encouraged high-density populations by mixing housing lots with apartment buildings far from the downtown core. The outer suburbs comprising the former municipalities of Etobicoke West, Scarborough East, and North York North largely retained the grid plan laid before post-war development. 105 sections were long established and quickly growing towns before the suburban housing boom began and the emergence of metropolitan government. Existing towns or villages such as Mimico, Islington, and New Toronto in Etobicoke, Willowdale, Newtonbrook, and Downsview in North York, Agincourt, Wexford, and West Hill in Scarborough, where suburban development boomed around or between these and other towns beginning in the late 1940s. Upscale neighborhoods were built, such as the Bridle Path in North York, the areas surrounding the Scarborough Bluffs and Guildwood, and most of central Etobicoke, such as Humber Valley Village and the Kingsway. One of the largest and earliest planned communities was Don Mills, parts of which were first built in the 1950s, 106-phase development, mixing single-detached housing with higher-density apartment blocks, became more popular as a suburban model of development. During the late 20th century, North York City Centre and Scarborough City Centre developed separate downtown districts outside downtown Toronto after the former boroughs were promoted to cities. High-rise development in these areas has given these former municipalities distinguishable skylines of their own, with high-density transit corridors serving them. Some of these developments are also transit-oriented, citation needed, industrial. The Distillery District holds the most extensive collection of preserved Victorian industrial architecture in North America. In the 1800s, a thriving industrial area developed around Toronto Harbour and the Lower Don River mouth, linked by rail and water to Canada and the United States. Examples included the Gooderham and Wirtz Distillery, Canadian Malting Company, the Toronto Rolling Mills, the Union Stockyards, and the Davies Pork Processing Facility, the inspiration for the Hogtown nickname 108-109. This industrial area expanded west along the harbor and rail lines and was supplemented by the infilling of the marshlands on the east side of the harbor to create the port lands. A garment industry developed along Lower Spadina Avenue, the Fashion District. Beginning in the late 19th century, industrial areas were set up on the outskirts, such as West Toronto, the Junction, where the stockyards relocated in 1903. The Great Fire of 1904 destroyed a large amount of industry in the downtown. Some companies moved west along King Street, and some moved as far west as Dufferin Street, where the large Massey Harris Farm Equipment Manufacturing Complex was located. Over time, pockets of industrial land mostly followed rail lines and later highway corridors as the city grew outwards. This trend continues to this day. The largest factories and distribution warehouses are in the suburban environs of Peel and York regions, but also within the current city, and Etobicoke concentrated around Pearson Airport, North York, and Scarborough. Citation needed. The West Don Lands is a former industrial site in downtown Toronto that has undergone redevelopment. Many of Toronto's former industrial sites close to or in downtown have been redeveloped, including parts of the Toronto waterfront, the rail yards west of downtown, and Liberty Village. The Massey Harris District and large-scale development is underway in the West Don Lands. Citation needed. The Gooderham and Wirtz Distillery produced spirits until 1990 and is preserved today as the Distillery District, the largest and best preserved collection of Victorian industrial architecture in North America. Some industry remains in the area, including the Redpath Sugar Refinery. Similar areas that retain their industrial character but are now largely residential are the Fashion District, Porttown, and parts of South Riverdale and Leslieville. Toronto still has some active older industrial areas, such as Brompton Village, Mimico, and New Toronto. In the west end of Old Toronto and York, the Weston, Mount Dennis, and the Junction areas still contain factories, meat-packing facilities, and rail yards close to medium-density residential. However, the Junction's Union Stockyards moved out of Toronto in 1994. The brownfield industrial area of the Port Lands, on the east side of the harbor, is one area planned for redevelopment. Formerly a marsh that was filled in to create industrial space, it was never intensely developed, its land unsuitable for large-scale development because of flooding and unstable soil. It still contains numerous industrial uses, such as the Portland's Energy Center power plant, port facilities, movie and television production studios, concrete processing facilities, and low-density industrial facilities. The Waterfront Toronto Agency has developed plans for a naturalized mount to the Don River and to create a flood barrier around the Don, making more of the land on the harbor suitable for higher-value residential and commercial development. A former chemicals plant site along the Don River is slated to become a large commercial complex and transportation hub. Architecture, main article, Architecture of Toronto. See also List of oldest buildings and structures in Toronto and List of tallest buildings in Toronto. The Rosalie Sharp Centre for Design, an extension of OCAD University's main building. Toronto's buildings vary in design and age, with many structures dating back to the early 19th century, while other prominent buildings were just newly built in the first decade of the 21st century. Lawrence Richards, a member of the Faculty of Architecture at the University of Toronto, has said, "Toronto is a new, brash, ragtag place, a big mix of periods and styles. Bay and gable houses, mainly found in Old Toronto, are a distinct architectural feature of the city. Defining the Toronto skyline is the CN Tower, a telecommunications and tourism hub. Completed in 1976 at a height of 553.33 meters, 1,815 feet 5 in, it was the world's tallest freestanding structure till 2007, when it was surpassed by Burj Khalifa in Dubai. Through the 1960s and 1970s, significant pieces of Toronto's architectural heritage were demolished to make way for redevelopment or parking. In contrast, since 2000, amid the Canadian property bubble, Toronto has experienced a condo construction boom and architectural revival, with several buildings opened by world-renowned architects. Daniel Libeskind's Royal Ontario Museum Edition, Frank Gehry's remake of the Art Gallery of Ontario, and Will Alsop's distinctive OCAD University expansion are among the city's new showpieces. The mid-1800s Distillery District, on the eastern edge of downtown, has been redeveloped into a pedestrian-oriented arts, culture, and entertainment neighborhood. This construction boom has some observers call the phenomenon the Manhattanization of Toronto after the densely built island borough of New York City. Toronto is an international center for business and finance. Generally considered the financial and industrial capital of Canada, Toronto has a high concentration of banks and brokerage firms on Bay Street in the financial district. The Toronto Stock Exchange is the world's 7th largest stock exchange by market capitalization, 169. The 5 largest financial institutions of Canada, collectively known as the Big Five, all have their global corporate headquarters in Toronto, alongside Canada's major insurance giants. Lake freighters moored in the Port of Toronto. The city is an important center for the media, publishing, telecommunication, information technology, and film production industries. It is home to Bell Media, Rogers Communications, and Torstar, other prominent Canadian corporations, and Canadian subsidiaries of international corporations in the Greater Toronto Area include Magna International, Pizza Pizza, Mr. Sub, Celestica, Manulife, Sun Life Financial, Toyota Canada Inc., the Hudson's Bay Company, and major hotel companies and operators, such as Four Seasons Hotels and Fairmont Hotels and Resorts. Although much of the region's manufacturing activities occur outside the city limits, Toronto continues to be a wholesale and distribution point for the industrial sector. The city's strategic position along the Quebec City-Windsor corridor within the Great Lakes megalopolis and its road and rail connections help support the nearby production of motor vehicles, iron, steel, food, machinery, chemicals, and paper. The completion of the St. Lawrence Seaway in 1959 gave ships access to the Great Lakes from the Atlantic Ocean. Toronto's unemployment rate was 6.7% as of July 2016. According to the website Numbeo, Toronto's cost of living plus rent index was second highest in Canada of 31 cities. The local purchasing power was the sixth lowest in Canada mid-2017. The average monthly social assistance caseload for January to October 2014 was 92,771. The number of impoverished seniors increased from 10.5% in 2011 to 12.1% in 2014. Toronto's 2013 child poverty rate was 28.6%, the highest among large Canadian cities of 500,000 or more residents. Bay Street, buildings in the financial district, including the operational headquarters of three major Canadian banks. The financial district in Toronto centers on Bay Street, the equivalent to Wall Street in New York. The city hosts the headquarters of all five of Canada's largest banks: Royal Bank of Canada, Toronto Dominion Bank, Scotiabank, Bank of Montreal, and Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, and was ranked as the safest banking system in the world between 2007 and 2014, according to the World Economic Forum. Toronto's economy has seen a steady growth boom thanks to many corporations relocating their Canadian headquarters into the city and Canada's growing cultural significance, resulting in several companies setting up shop in Toronto. Media and entertainment. Main article, Media in Toronto. 33 Dundas Street East is a studio complex used by City TV and Omni Television. Toronto is Canada's largest media market and has for conventional dailies, 2 alt weeklies, and 3 free commuter papers in a greater metropolitan area of about 6 million inhabitants. The Toronto Star and the Toronto Sun are the prominent daily city newspapers, while national dailies The Globe and Mail and the National Post are also headquartered in the city. The Toronto Star, The Globe and Mail, and National Post are broadsheet newspapers. Several magazines and local newspapers cover Toronto, including Now and Toronto Life, while numerous magazines are produced in Toronto, such as Canadian Business, Chatelaine, Flair, and Maclean's. Daily Hive, Western Canada's largest online-only publication, opened its Toronto office in 2016. Toronto contains the headquarters of the major English-language Canadian television networks CBC, CTV, CityTV, Global, the sports network TSN, and Sportsnet. Much formerly Muck Music, M3 formerly Muckmore, and MTV Canada are the main music television channels based in the city. However, they no longer primarily show music videos as a result of channel drift amid a shift in demographics. Film production, see also Hollywood North. Film production for The Boys at Peacock Square. Toronto is one of the centers of Canada's film and television industry due in part to the lower cost of production in Canada. The city's streets and landmarks are seen in a variety of films, mimicking the scenes of American cities such as Chicago and New York. The city provides diverse settings and neighborhoods to shoot films, with production facilitated by Toronto's Film and Television Office. Toronto's film industry has extended beyond the Toronto CMA into adjoining cities such as Hamilton and Oshawa. Real estate. Real estate is a major force in the city's economy. Toronto is home to some of the nation and the world's most expensive real estate. The Toronto Regional Real Estate Board TREB, formerly the Toronto Real Estate Board, is a non-profit professional association of registered real estate brokers and salespeople in Toronto and parts of the Greater Toronto Area. TRREB was formed in 1920. Many large real estate investment trusts are based in Toronto. Technology and biotech. Toronto is a large hub of the Canadian and global technology industry, generating $50 billion in revenues annually. In 2017, Toronto tech firms offered almost 30,000 jobs, which is higher than the combination of San Francisco Bay Area. Seattle and Washington, D.C. THE area bound between the Greater Toronto Area. The region of Waterloo and the city of Hamilton was termed a digital corridor by the Branham Group. 180 for a region highly concentrated with technology companies and jobs similar to Silicon Valley in California. Toronto is home to a large startup ecosystem and is the third largest center for information and communications technology in North America, behind New York City and the Silicon Valley. In 2023, the city was ranked as the 17th best startup scene in the world. Tourism main article, Tourism in Toronto. See also Hotels in Toronto, Kensington Market, a neighborhood that is also partly an outdoor market. In 2018, 27.5 million tourists visited Toronto, generating $10.3 billion till the $12.3 billion in 2023 in economic activity. The Toronto Eden Centre receives over 47 million visitors per year. 188 other commercial areas popular with tourists include the Path Network, which is the world's largest 189 underground shopping complex, as well as Kensington Market and St. Lawrence Market. 190. The Toronto Islands are close to downtown Toronto and do not permit private motor vehicles beyond the airport. Other tourist attractions include the CN Tower, Casa Loma, Toronto's theaters and musicals, Yonge Dundas Square, and Ripley's Aquarium of Canada. The Royal Ontario Museum is a museum of world culture and natural history. The Toronto Zoo is home to over 5,000 animals, representing over 460 distinct species. The Art Gallery of Ontario contains an extensive collection of Canadian, European, African, and contemporary artwork. Also, it hosts exhibits from museums and galleries from all over the world. The Gardner Museum of Ceramic Art is the only museum in Canada entirely devoted to ceramics, and the museum's collection contains more than 2,900 ceramic works from Asia, the Americas, and Europe. The city also hosts the Ontario Science Centre, the Bonnechet Museum and Textile Museum of Canada, the Southern Facade of the Art Gallery of Ontario. Other prominent art galleries and museums include the Design Exchange, the TIFF Lightbox, the Museum of Contemporary Art Toronto, Canada, the Institute for Contemporary Culture, the Toronto Sculpture Garden, the CBC Museum, the Redpath Sugar Museum, the University of Toronto Art Centre, Hard House, the TD Gallery of Inuit Art, Little Canada, and the Aga Khan Museum. The city also runs its own museums, which include the Spadina House. The Don Valley Brickworks is a former industrial site that opened in 1889 and was partly restored as a park and heritage site in 1996, with further restoration being completed in stages since then. The Canadian National Exhibition is held annually at Exhibition Place and is the oldest annual fair in the world. The X has an average attendance of 1.5 million. City shopping areas include the Yorkville neighborhood, Queen West, Harbourfront, the Entertainment District, the Financial District, and the St. Lawrence Market neighborhood. The Eden Centre is Toronto's most popular tourist attraction, with over 52 million visitors annually. The Hockey Hall of Fame is a museum dedicated to ice hockey, as well as a Hall of Fame. Greektown on the Danforth is home to the annual Taste of the Danforth Festival, which attracts over 1 million people into 12 days. Toronto is also home to Casa Loma, the former estate of Sir Henry Pellet, a prominent Toronto financier, industrialist, and military man. Other notable neighborhoods and attractions in Toronto include the beaches, the Toronto Islands, Kensington Market, Fort York, and the Hockey Hall of Fame. Toronto's theater and performing arts scene has more than 50 ballet and dance companies, 6 opera companies, 2 symphony orchestras, many music venues, and a host of theaters. The city is home to the National Ballet of Canada, the Canadian Opera Company, 233 the Toronto Symphony Orchestra, the Canadian Electronic Ensemble, and the Canadian Stage Company. Notable performance venues include the Four Seasons Centre for the Performing Arts, Roy Thomson Hall, the Princess of Wales Theatre, the Royal Alexandra Theatre, Massey Hall, the Meridian Arts Centre, formerly the Toronto Centre for the Arts, the Elgin and Winter Garden Theatres, and the Meridian Hall, originally the O'Keefe Centre and formerly the Hummingbird Centre, and the Sony Centre for the Performing Arts. Ontario Place features the world's first permanent IMAX movie theatre, the Cinesphere, as well as the Budweiser Stage, formerly Molson Amphitheatre. an open-air venue for music concerts. In the spring of 2012, Ontario Place closed after declining attendance. Although the Budweiser stage and harbor still operate, the park and Cinesphere are no longer in use. There are ongoing plans to revitalize Ontario Place. The Cinesphere at Ontario Place. Each summer, the Canadian Stage Company presents an outdoor Shakespeare production in Toronto's High Park called Dream in High Park. Canada's Walk of Fame acknowledges the achievements of successful Canadians with a series of stars on designated blocks of sidewalks along King Street and Simcoe Street. The production of domestic and foreign film and television is a major local industry. As of 2011, Toronto ranks as the third largest production center for film and television after Los Angeles and New York City, sharing the nickname Hollywood North with Vancouver. The Toronto International Film Festival is an annual event celebrating the international film industry. Another film festival is the Take 21, formerly the Toronto Student Film Festival, which screens the works of students 12 to 18 years of age from many different countries across the globe. The Grand Parade for the Caribana Festival on Lakeshore Boulevard. Toronto's Caribana, formerly known as Scotiabank Caribbean Carnival, takes place from mid-July to early August of every summer. Primarily based on the Trinidad and Tobago Carnival, the first Caribana took place in 1967 when the city's Caribbean community celebrated Canada's centennial. More than 40 years later, it has grown to attract 1 million people to Toronto's Lakeshore Boulevard annually. Tourism for the festival is in the hundreds of thousands, and each year, the event generates over $400 million in revenue for Ontario's economy. One of the most significant events in the city, Pride Week, takes place in late June and is one of the largest LGBTQ+ festivals in the world. Food, main article, list of Michelin-starred restaurants in Toronto. Sports, main article, sports in Toronto. See also amateur sport in Toronto, a list of sports teams in Toronto. This section needs additional citations for verification. Please help improve this article by adding citations to reliable sources in this section. Unsourced material may be challenged and removed. July 2016, learn how and when to remove this message. Queen City Yacht Club facilities and piers on the Toronto Islands. Toronto is represented in 5 major league sports, with teams in the National Hockey League and HL, Major League Baseball MLB, National Basketball Association NBA, Canadian Football League CFL, and Major League Soccer MLS. It was formerly represented in a 6th and 7th. The USLW League that announced on November 6, 2015 that it would cease operation ahead of the 2016 season, and the Canadian Women's Hockey League ceased operations in May 2019. The city's major sports venues include the Scotiabank Arena, formerly Air Canada Centre, Rogers Centre, formerly Skydome, Coca-Cola Coliseum, formerly Ricoh Coliseum, and BMO Field. Toronto is one of 6 North American cities alongside Dallas, Chicago, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and the New York tri-state area to have won titles in its 5 major leagues: MLB, NHL, NBA, MLS, and either NFL or CFL, and the only one to have done so in the historic sports clubs of Toronto include the Granite Club, established in 1836, the Royal Canadian Yacht Club, established in 1852, the Toronto Cricket Skating and Curling Club, established before 1827, the Argonaut Rowing Club, established in 1872, the Toronto Lawn Tennis Club, established in 1881, and the Badminton and Racquet Club, established in 1924. Professional sports, the 2016 American League Wild Card game played at Rogers Centre. The Toronto Blue Jays use the stadium. Toronto is home to the Toronto Maple Leafs, one of the NHL's original 6 clubs, and has also served as home to the Hockey Hall of Fame since 1958. The city had a rich history of hockey championships. Along with the Maple Leafs' 13 Stanley Cup titles, the Toronto Marlboros and St. Michael's College School-based Ontario Hockey League teams combined, have won a record 12 Memorial Cup titles. The Toronto Marlies of the American Hockey League also play in Toronto at Coca-Cola Coliseum and are the farm team for the Maple Leafs. The Toronto Six, the first Canadian franchise in the National Women's Hockey League, began play with the 2020-21 season. However, the National Women's Hockey League folded. Its successor, the Professional Women's Hockey League, has the Toronto Septas. The city is home to the Toronto Blue Jays MLB baseball team. The team has won two World Series titles 1992, 1993. The Blue Jays play their home games at the Rogers Centre in the downtown core. Toronto has a long history of minor league professional baseball dating back to the 1800s, culminating in the Toronto Maple Leafs baseball team, whose owner first proposed an MLB team for Toronto. The Toronto Raptors basketball team entered the NBA in 1995 and has since earned 11 playoff spots and 5 Atlantic Division titles in 24 seasons. They won their first NBA title in 2019. The Raptors are the only NBA team with their own television channel, NBA TV Canada. They play their home games at Scotiabank Arena, which is shared with the Maple Leafs. In 2016, Toronto hosted the 65th NBA All-Star Game, the first to be held outside the United States. The Toronto Tempo of the WNBA will begin play in 2026. Scotiabank Arena from Bremer Boulevard. The NBA's Toronto Raptors and the NHL's Toronto Maple Leafs played their home games at the arena. The city is represented in Canadian football by the CFL's Toronto Argonauts, which was founded in 1873. The club has won 18 Grey Cup Canadian Championship titles. The club's home games are played at BMO Field. View of BMO Field from the grandstands. The CFL's Toronto Argonauts and MLS Toronto FC play their home games at the outdoor stadium. Toronto is represented in soccer by the Toronto FC MLS team, who have won 7 Canadian Championship titles, as well as the MLS Cup in 2017 and the Supporters' Shield for Best Regular Season Record, also in 2017. They share BMO Field with the Toronto Argonauts. Toronto has a high level of participation in soccer across the city at several smaller stadiums and fields. Toronto FC entered the league as an expansion team in 2007. The Toronto Rock is the city's National Lacrosse League team. They won 5 National Lacrosse League Cup titles in 7 years in the late 1990s and the first decade of the 21st century, appearing in an NLL record 5 straight championship games from 1999 to 2003, and are first all-time in the number. The Rock formerly shared the Scotiabank Arena with the Maple Leafs and the Raptors. However, the Toronto Rock moved to the nearby city of Hamilton while retaining its Toronto name. The Toronto Wolfpack became Canada's first professional rugby league team and the world's first transatlantic professional sports team when they began play in the Rugby Football League's League One competition in 2017. 264 due to COVID-19 restrictions on international travel, the team withdrew from the Super League in 2020 with its future uncertain. 265. The rugby club's ownership changed in 2021. Now Team Wolfpack will play in the newly formed North American Rugby League tournament. Toronto is home to the Toronto Rush, a semi-professional ultimate team that competes in the American Ultimate Disc League AUDL. Ultimate Disc in Canada has its beginning roots in Toronto, with 3,300 players competing annually in the Toronto Ultimate Club League. Toronto has hosted several National Football League and FL exhibition games at the Rogers Centre. Toronto is a central transportation hub for road, rail, and air networks in southern Ontario. The city has many forms of transport, including highways and public transit. Toronto also has an extensive network of bicycle lanes and multi-use trails and paths. Public transportation. Main article: Public transportation in Toronto. Toronto's primary public transportation system is operated by the Toronto Transit Commission (TTC), The backbone of its public transport network is the Toronto subway system, which includes 3 heavy rail rapid transit lines spanning the city, including the U-shaped Line 1, East-West Line 2, and the short East-West Line, with Line 1 extending far beyond city limits as Vaughan Metropolitan Center, King Street. The streetcar system is the largest and busiest such system in North America. The TTC also operates an extensive network of buses and streetcars, with the latter serving the downtown core and buses serving many parts of the city not served by the sparse subway network. TTC buses and streetcars use the same fare system as the subway, and many subway stations offer a fare-paid area for transfers between rail and surface vehicles. A TTC subway for Line 1 Yonge University at Rosedale Station. There have been numerous plans to extend the subway and implement light rail lines, but budgetary concerns have thwarted many efforts. By November 2011, construction on Line 5 at Clinton began. Line 5 is scheduled to finish construction by 2024. In 2015, the Ontario government promised to fund Line 6 Finch West, which is to be completed by 2024. In 2019, the Government of Ontario released a transit plan for the Greater Toronto Area, which includes a new 16-kilometer, 9.9 miles Ontario line, Line 1 extension to Richmond Hill Centre, a Line 2 extension to Shepherd Avenue/McCowan Road to replace Line 3, and an extension for Line 5 Eglinton to Toronto's century-old Union Station is also getting a major renovation and upgrade, which would be able to accommodate more rail traffic from GO Transit, Via Rail, Up Express, and Amtrak. Construction on a new Union Station bus terminal is also in the works, with an expected completion in 2020. Toronto's public transit network also connects to other municipal networks such as York Region Transit, Viva, Durham Region Transit, Brampton Transit, and MeWay. The Government of Ontario operates a regional rail and bus transit system called GO Transit in the Greater Toronto Area. GO Transit carries over 250,000 passengers every weekday 2013 and 57 million annually, with the majority of them traveling to or from Union Station. Metrolinx is currently implementing regional express rail into its GO Transit network and plans to electrify many of its rail lines by 2030. The Union Station Rail Corridor at Union Station. The corridor is used by commuter and intercity rail services. Intercity transportation. Toronto Union Station serves as a hub for Via Rail's intercity services in central Canada and includes services to various parts of Ontario. Corridor services to Montreal and National Capital Ottawa, and long-distance services to Vancouver and New York City. GO Transit provides intercity bus services from the Union Station, bus terminal, and other bus terminals in the city to destinations within the Golden Horseshoe. Long-distance intercity coach services by multiple companies also operated from the Union Station bus terminal and provide a network of services to further cities in Ontario, neighboring provinces, and the United States. The Toronto Coach Terminal formerly served as the city's intercity coach hub from 1931 to 2021, when the terminal was decommissioned. Airports, interior of Toronto Pearson International Airport's Terminal 1. Toronto Pearson serves as the international airport for the Greater Toronto Area. Canada's busiest airport, Toronto Pearson International Airport IATA, YYZ, straddles the city's western boundary with the suburban city of Mississauga. The Union Pearson Express Up Express train service provides a direct link between Pearson International and Union Station. It began carrying passengers in June 2015. Better source needed. Limited commercial and passenger service to nearby destinations in Canada and the United States is offered from the Billy Bishop Toronto City Airport IATA, YTZ on the Toronto Islands, southwest of downtown. Downsview Airport IATA, YZD, near the city's north end, is owned by de Havilland Canada and serves the Bombardier Aviation Aircraft Factory. Within a few hours' drive, Hamilton's John C. Munro International Airport, IATA, YHM, and Buffalo's Buffalo Niagara International Airport, IATA. BUF serve as alternate airports for the Toronto area in addition to serving their respective cities. A secondary international airport, to be located northeast of Toronto in Pickering, has been planned by the Government of Canada. Streets and highways. Highway 401 is a 400 series highway that passes west to east through Greater Toronto. Toronto's portion of Highway 401 is the busiest highway in North America. The grid of major city streets was laid out by a concession road system in which major arterial roads are 6,600 feet to 0.0 kilometers apart, with some exceptions, particularly in Scarborough and Etobicoke, as they used a different survey. Major east-west arterial roads are generally parallel with the Lake Ontario shoreline, and major north-south arterial roads are roughly perpendicular to the shoreline, though slightly angled north of Eglinton Avenue. This arrangement is sometimes broken by geographical accidents, most notably the Don River ravines. Toronto's grid north is approximately 18.5 to the west of true north. Many arterials, particularly north-south ones, due to the city originally being within the former York County, continue beyond the city into the 905 suburbs and further into the rural countryside. There are several municipal expressways and provincial highways that serve Toronto and the Greater Toronto area. In particular, Highway 401 bisects the city from west to east, bypassing the downtown core. It is the busiest road in North America, 320, and one of the busiest highways in the world. Other provincial highways include Highway 400, which connects the city with Northern Ontario and beyond, and Highway 404, an extension of the Don Valley Parkway into the northern suburbs. The Queen Elizabeth Way QEW, North America's first divided intercity highway, terminates at Toronto's western boundary and connects Toronto to Niagara Falls and Buffalo. The main municipal expressways in Toronto include the Gardiner Expressway, the Don Valley Parkway, and, to some extent, Allen Road. Toronto's traffic congestion is one of the highest in North America and is the second highest in Canada after Vancouver. Toronto is a single-tier municipality governed by a mayor-council system. The structure of the municipal government is stipulated by the City of Toronto Act. The Mayor of Toronto is elected by direct popular vote to serve as the chief executive of the city. The Toronto City Council is a unicameral legislative body comprising 25 councillors since the 2018 municipal election, representing geographical wards throughout the city. The mayor and members of the city council serve 4-year terms without term limits. Until the 2006 municipal election, the mayor and city councillors served 3-year terms. Toronto City Hall is the seat of the municipal government of Toronto. As of 2016, the city council has 12 standing committees, each consisting of a chair. Some have a vice chair and several councillors. The mayor names the committee chairs, and the remaining members of the committees are appointed by city council. An executive committee is formed by the chairs of each standing committee, the mayor, the deputy mayor, and for other councillors. Councillors are also appointed to oversee the Toronto Transit Commission and the Toronto Police Services Board. The city has 4 community councils that consider local matters. The city council has delegated final decision-making authority on local, routine matters, while others like planning and zoning issues are recommended to the city council. Each city councillor serves as a member of a community council. There are about 40 subcommittees and advisory committees appointed by the city council. These bodies are made up of city councillors and private citizen volunteers. Examples include the Pedestrian Committee, Waste Diversion Task Force 2010, and the Task Force to Bring Back the Dawn. The City of Toronto had an approved operating budget of 13.53 billion Canadian dollars in 2020 and a 10-year capital budget and plan of 43.5 billion Canadian dollars. The city's revenues include subsidies from the Government of Canada and the Government of Ontario for programs mandated by those governments, 33% from property tax, 6% from the land transfer tax, and the rest from other tax revenues and user fees. The city's largest operating expenditures are the Toronto Transit Commission at 2.14 billion Canadian dollars and the Toronto Police Service, 1.22 billion Canadian dollars. The site of Toronto lay at the entrance to one of the oldest routes to the northwest, a route known and used by the Huron, Iroquois, and Ojibwe. Archaeological sites show evidence of human occupation dating back thousands of years. The site was of strategic importance from the beginning of Ontario's recorded history. In the 1660s, the Iroquois established 2 villages within what is today Toronto, Ganatsaquayagan Bead Hill on banks of the Rouge River and Tioga on the banks of the Humber River. By 1701, the Mississaugas had displaced the Iroquois, who abandoned the Toronto area at the end of the Beaver Wars, with most returning to their homeland in present-day New York State. French traders founded Fort Louis in 1750. The current exhibition grounds were later developed there, but abandoned it in 1759 during the 7 Years' War. 50 for the British defeated the French and their Indigenous allies in the war, and the area became part of the British colony of Quebec in 1763. During the American Revolutionary War, an influx of British settlers arrived there as United Empire Loyalists fled for the British-controlled lands north of Lake Ontario. The Crown granted them land to compensate for their losses in the 13 colonies. The new province of Upper Canada was being created and needed a capital. In 1787, the British Lord Dorchester arranged for the Toronto Purchase with the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, thereby securing more than 250,000 acres, 1,000 square kilometers of land in the Toronto area. Dorchester intended the location to be named Toronto 48. The first 25 years after the Toronto Purchase were quiet, although there were occasional independent fur traders present in the area, with the usual complaints of debauchery and drunkenness. In 1793, Governor John Graves Simcoe established the town of York on the Toronto Purchase lands, naming it after Prince Frederick, Duke of York and Albany. Simcoe decided to move the Upper Canada capital from Newark-Niagara-on-the-Lake to York, 56 believing the new site would be less vulnerable to attack by the United States. 57. The York garrison was built at the entrance of the town's natural harbor, sheltered by a long sandbar peninsula. The town settlement formed at the harbor's eastern and behind the peninsula, near the present-day intersection of Parliament Street and Front Street in the Old Town area. 19th century, an American squadron exchanging fire with Fort York during the Battle of York. 1813. The American landing is depicted to the west left foreground. In 1813, as part of the War of 1812, the Battle of York ended in the town's capture and plunder by United States forces. John Strachan negotiated the town's surrender. American soldiers destroyed much of the garrison and set fire to the Parliament buildings during their 5-day occupation. Because of the sacking of York, British troops retaliated later in the war with the burning of Washington, D.C. York was incorporated as the city of Toronto on March 6, 1834. Adopted reformist politician William Lyon Mackenzie became the first mayor of Toronto. Mackenzie would later lead the unsuccessful Upper Canada Rebellion of 1837 against the British colonial government. Toronto's population of 9,000 included some African-American slaves. Citation needed, some of whom had been brought by the Loyalists, and Black Loyalists, whom the Crown had freed. Most of the latter were resettled in Nova Scotia. By 1834, refugee slaves from America's South were also immigrating to Toronto to gain freedom. 60 slavery was banned outright in Upper Canada and throughout the British Empire in 1834. Torontonians integrated people of color into their society. In the 1840s, an eating house at Frederick and King Streets, a place of mercantile prosperity in the early city, was operated by a black man named Buxom. Toronto in 1854. The city was a major destination for immigrants to Canada in the second half of the 19th century. As a major destination for immigrants to Canada, the city grew rapidly through the remainder of the 19th century. The first significant wave of immigrants were Irish, fleeing the Great Irish Famine. Most of them were Catholic. By 1851, the Irish-born population had become the largest single ethnic group in the city. The Scottish and English population welcomed smaller numbers of Protestant Irish immigrants, some from what is now Northern Ireland, which gave the Orange Order significant and long-lasting influence over Toronto's society. Almost every mayor of Toronto was a member of the Orange Order between 1850 and 1950, and the city was sometimes referred to as the Belfast of Canada because of Orange influence in municipal politics and administration. For brief periods, Toronto was twice the capital of the United Province of Canada, first from 1849 to 1851, following unrest in Montreal, and later from 1855 to after this date. Quebec was designated as the capital until 1865, 2 years before Canadian Confederation. Since then, the capital of Canada has remained Ottawa, Ontario. The Second Parliament of Upper Canada building on Front Street, 1856. Toronto became the capital of the province of Ontario after its official creation in 1867. The seat of government of the Ontario briefly returned to the same building that hosted the Third Parliament building of Upper Canada before moving to the Ontario Legislative Building at Queen's Park in 1893. Because of its provincial capital status, the city was also the location of Government House, the residence of the vice-regal representative of the Crown in right of Ontario. Long before the Royal Military College of Canada was established in 1876, supporters of the concept proposed military colleges in Canada. Staffed by British regulars, adult male students underwent a 3-month-long military course at the School of Military Instruction in Toronto. Established by Militia General Order in 1864, the school enabled officers of militia or candidates for commission or promotion in the militia to learn military duties, drill and discipline, to command a company at battalion drill, to drill a company at company drill, the internal economy of a company, and the duties of a company's officer. The school was retained at Confederation in 1867. In 1868, schools of cavalry and artillery instruction were formed in Toronto. A group in front of a horse-drawn streetcar in front of Yorkville Town Hall, 1870. A gas street lamp is visible in the right foreground. In the 19th century, the city built an extensive sewage system to improve sanitation, and streets were illuminated with gas lighting as a regular service. Citation-needed long-distance railway lines were constructed, including a route completed in 1850 for linking Toronto with the Upper Great Lakes. The Grand Trunk Railway and the Northern Railway of Canada joined in the building of the first Union Station in downtown. The advent of the railway dramatically increased the numbers of immigrants arriving, commerce and industry, as had the Lake Ontario steamers and schooners entering port before. These enabled Toronto to become a major gateway linking the world to the interior of the North American continent. Expanding port and rail facilities brought in northern timber for export and imported Pennsylvania coal. Industry dominated the waterfront for the next 100 years. During the late 19th century, Toronto became the largest alcohol distillation, in particular, spirit center in North America. By the 1860s, the Gooderham and Wirtz distillery operations became the world's largest whiskey factory. Citation needed. A preserved section of this once dominant local industry remains in the distillery district. The harbor allowed access to grain and sugar imports used in processing. The Gooderham and Wirtz buildings, 1896. Horse-drawn streetcars gave way to electric streetcars in 1891 when the city granted the operation of the transit franchise to the Toronto Railway Company. The public transit system passed into public ownership in 1921 as the Toronto Transportation Commission, later renamed the Toronto Transit Commission. The system now has the third highest ridership of any city public transportation system in North America.